Hi, and welcome to Contercast. My name's Kat Boyd, and I'm joined with my lovely, glamorous co-host, David Jameson.
How's it going? I'm getting bronzer by the day in this beautiful sunshine.
We're like pink. You're going like sort of, you just need like a slice of lemon on your, pineapple on your chest.
Lemon.
Sunstroke.
Lemon if you're a bit more exotic, yeah, but pineapple will do, yeah.
I'm fine. I just have been out in the sun and I'm a bit dehydrated. We also have a very special guest with us today. We are joined by George Hoare, who is 1/3 of the Aufhebungabunga podcast, and he's here to tell us all about their new book called The End of History, which is available to buy right now on all good websites. You know the ones. So George, welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, I would say sort of first time, long time. So yeah, very glad to be on the podcast.
Great. We're so glad to have you join us. So just for our listeners who may or may not have listened to your show before, tell us a bit about the Aufhebungabunga podcast and the sort of general project behind it all.
Yeah, so we started the podcast in 2017 after basically the big political events of the preceding year, so particularly Brexit and the election of Trump. And I guess what we've been trying to do is have a kind of global view. We call ourselves a global politics podcast at the end of history, and I'm sure we'll discuss a lot about what the end of history means. But yeah, I think it's ideally a place to kind of bring on people that we don't always agree with, have a bit of a discussion, and try to, I think, unpack some of the key ideas and try and make a bit of a route through some of the kind of political movements and the various things that have happened in the past, almost like 4 years of politics, which seem to be a lot more eventful than the years that preceded them. So yeah, that's the general project, I guess.
Wonderful. Well, we are both avid listeners of your show. I know David certainly is.
Oh, I should have said that you can. I need to plug it. If you are a listener of the podcast of Aufhebungabunga, you can subscribe on patreon.com/bungacast at $5, $10 or $30 a month, and you get various goodies depending on how much dosh you give us. So you've always got to be selling, always got to sell the product. So yeah, sorry if I neglected to do that to start with.
You've always got to whore yourself out in the modern context, you know.
Very much so.
And it is like, what I like about the podcast is the way it's kind of informed the book, and it's made me kind of more friendly to the podcast as a concept. Like at the start of the book, you actually say like, everyone's got a joke about podcasting now. It's the sort of thing that D-class A middle class people do. They have a podcast, but this is quite an interesting book project in the sense that you've actually used the podcast to construct your arguments, to interview people from around the world. And it's a huge area of interviews by this point, whether they be sort of activists or academics or whoever. And you've collected that all together for the arguments in the book. So it makes podcasting seem like quite a serious, worthwhile enterprise, or at least more so than the innumerable sports and pop music and politics podcasts.
Yeah, I mean, so I think we're basically in the pub. The three of us have known each other for more than a decade. So we knew each other before doing the podcast, which I think was quite useful, just in that we were like texting back and forth on WhatsApp, and then went to the pub and thought, well, we could do a podcast. Look at all these other podcasts. We could do one of these. And then, I think it's sort of, we decided to maybe be a bit more sort of serious about it and think, actually, what is it that we kind of want to know about, and just use that as an excuse to have to read books before interviewing people, and get sent review copies, so save a bit of money that way as well. So yeah, I think it's been kind of, as you said, 200 episodes now, so quite a few different sort of perspectives contained within the guests that we've had.
So, David, I think you're down for the first question if we just want to kick off.
Yeah, sure. Although I did want to ask, like, beyond, so 10 years ago, I mean, did you sort of come into this from a given political perspective? I'm kind of interested in what the background of, perhaps you can only speak for yourself, George, but what was your sort of political attitude before the beginning of the project?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's probably worth saying that the three of us don't agree on everything, don't see eye to eye on absolutely everything by any stretch of the imagination. But I think we'd all kind of been associated with various groups that kind of come out of, I guess, the defeat of British, or the collapse of kind of British Leninism to a greater or lesser extent, if you want to call it that. That's maybe a bit grandiose way to put it. So yeah, I mean, I think the kind of casting my mind back 10 years, or even like to 2016, I think I was probably pretty negative or kind of apathetic in general, pretty kind of disillusioned. So I think it's been, to a certain extent, I hope the book and the podcast trace out a little bit of the kind of enthusiasm. I think the politicizing impact of Brexit has been enormous and enormously positive. And I think that's kind of hopefully gives the whole thing a little bit of energy, because I think the kind of the period, and I'm sure we'll come on to talk about this, but the period of the end of history, like who would join the Labour Party in like 2003, 2004, like 2010? It's like in that sort of period, it politics doesn't seem particularly interesting. And now I think it's, there's so much going on that it's impossible to not be enraged, excited, kind of energized by the discussions and the kind of the conflicts that we're having at the moment.
So before we get on to the end of the end of history, because I think a lot of people, I mean, we are very familiar with the phrase "the end of history" if you've been on the left for the last 20 years or there around. Obviously, a phrase that has a long history, but it was used infamously in left-wing circles, I suppose, by Francis Fukuyama around the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And he, said basically that historical alternatives to liberal capitalism had been extinguished. You can probably define the argument better than me, but this was the broad thrust. And that argument is very, very unpopular on the left and is often, as you say in the book, caricatured on the left. You sort of largely endorse this idea that we approached that we achieved the end of history at the time that Francis Fukuyama was writing about it, and that's quite unusual. Like I say, much of the left tend to dismiss it. What do you think is useful in Fukuyama's concept of the end of history, his use in that historical juncture?
Yeah, no, I think it's definitely something to take seriously, even if there are certain key aspects of it that I think are wrong, that I definitely personally wouldn't endorse. So just to kind of give maybe a bit of the background. So this idea of the end of history, taken from a 1989 article that Fukuyama, who was then working in the American State Department, wrote with the title "The End of History with a question mark." Then the book comes out in 1992 without the question mark, and it's "The End of History and the Last Man." And yeah, he, as you said, David, he basically argues that history is done. It's over with. We've witnessed the fall. When the Soviet Union fell, and this is a quote, it was not just the passing of a particular period of post-war history, but the end of history as such. That is the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. So that's like a pretty bold claim. And that's probably one of the reasons why, why one, it was so popular, and two, it's so disliked by various people, because it's a pretty big sort of grandiose claim. I mean, Fukuyama is obviously not the first person to think in terms of history having an end. It's an idea he takes from Hegel, this idea that history has a kind of a telos, or an endpoint that it's driving towards. Marx, the idea of communism, like that's the end of the prehistory of mankind. But anyway, so Fukuyama's this idea definitely struck a nerve and was extremely popular. And in terms of how we use it on the podcast, I think it's important just to say that it is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, and just in that we would reject the idea that liberal democracy is the final possible form of human government, but rather that he really strikes on something important, which is there is a period that started in 1989, and we I think we felt that period had ended in 2016, and what characterized it, and kind of by implication, what characterizes the period that we're in at the moment. Because I think that is a really tricky question. And if there's been one question that we've been trying to answer across all these interviews in the podcast, it's really like what characterizes the current period. I don't know how keen you are on having some dates fired at you, but I've got some to in the chamber if that's useful.
Go for it.
Yeah. So I think and then this is definitely something which doesn't come out particularly well in podcasting, but I'm going to do it anyway. So like, I think to put it into the context that we approached it with. So Eric Hobsbawm, who's a Marxist historian, his history of the short 20th century, I think is, I think it's a fantastic book. And so he says in the 20th century, short 20th century, there were these three periods. 1914 to 45 was the age of catastrophe, so the two world wars. 1945 to 73, this was the 30 glorious years, or what he calls the golden years, post-war boom, particularly in Western Europe. And then 73 to 91 is the landslide. So all of these kind of this kind of post-war class compromise essentially collapses, and you have a whole set of crises of capitalism, of late capitalism, as some people have called it. So yeah, that's basically sort of why we think it's a useful idea, because it raises the question, like, what is it that defines that period after 89, after 91? And I think the feeling of like exhaustion and ending, like politics being quite like not about big questions, but being quite dull, quite boring. I think that's why it's a useful idea.
And Eric Hobsbawm does get I think he gets a little mention in your book quite near the start. I remember reading that bit and being like, oh, okay, yeah, so I now, just as you said, like I understand like how these parts fit together, with your starting point being the end of history and the end of that. But your book doesn't really start with high politics, but pop culture, which is, part of the reason I enjoyed it. I do enjoy how pop culture and politics interact. And I think that, the things that you said, particularly like in the introduction, reflects our own, my experience. And, I'm sure David too, have grown up when political resistance had been essentially nullified. And we often experience rebellion primarily through popular music and consumerism. And you mentioned the early days of techno and rave, and I think the line is something like, the world felt open and full of possibility, at least for oneself as an individual. And it made me think of like the way that Microsoft branded its whole enterprise in the 90s on like, where do you want to go today? You describe in the book that this open world like would shake off public duties, maybe such as solidarity or collectivism. And you also reference Britpop, especially its invitation to Downing Street. So my cat's having a little meow in the background. But yeah, you mentioned that, and the cringe-tastic Cool Britannia. And I've always seen that Cool Britannia moment as a really natural part of Blair's strategy, driving the identity politics of the age. You had like Blair's Babes, as like assault to gender equality. You had Noel Gallagher, who becomes this like caricature of what it means to be working class. And you also mentioned Kurt Cobain. I mean, sidebar, I have this theory that had Kurt Cobain been alive today, he would probably be completely insufferable and have like the worst liberal politics. But anyway,
I think that's certainly true. I mean, I should say that I'm not and never have been a Nirvana fan. I think they're one of the three most overrated bands, along with the Doors and Pink Floyd, just to really rile.
Correct on the Doors. Correct, I would say. Like, I think that they were really just they're more of a motif of like a particular a point in time and a culture, like a counterculture that's linked to them. But musically, I mean, that cover of like Bertolt Brecht's "Show Me the Way to the Whiskey Bar," nonsense.
Yeah. And Smells Like Teen Spirit is just a Pixies ripoff, as Cobain said himself. But I think he's like an interesting figure and an important one, because I guess like the argument that we try and make in the book is sort of that popular culture is important for at least two reasons here. One is that all of the kind of political or kind of oppositional energy that previously might have gone into or been channeled by various political projects then goes into culture. But that's a complete dead end. The left, I think, often sort of has a refuge in kind of culture or kind of countercultural ideas. But in fact, I think as Cobain shows, it's like, he's illustrative of the way that even this kind of rebellion was already being commodified, sold back as oppositional. Capital was very, did not break a sweat at all in kind of, in repackaging that and throwing it back. And the second thing is that I think this like I'm going to annoy all your listeners, but I'm also really not a fan of saying that rave is in any way political. I think it's it's kind of like Occupy or these kind of it's people who are doing something which is not necessarily bad in and of itself, but to say that that's a kind of lasting political strategy or is going to be building anything, I think is pretty self-serving and delusional. So sorry to all the ravers out there, but you can still go and rave. But I don't think it's political. It's just the outer edge of mainstream culture, which is it's fine, I think. Yeah. So yeah, it's closing off all those political alternatives, so you retreat to the cultural ones. But the second point is that I think it also sets the scene for what happens in 2016, and this kind of like everything is very so one thing about like techno music in general, it's quite repetitive. There's no narrative there. So when you kind of have the reinsertion of politics in some way with Brexit and Trump, this is maybe reading a bit too much into this, but I think it's representative of the whole culture. Basically, people can't deal with it. Commentators cannot understand what's happening, and so the response that they have is not a sort of rational one. It becomes quite a hysterical one.
I remember saying that after I'd read that opening chapter, and you talk about how it feels to be at the end of history. And what I was shocked by was the commonality, not just of the cultural experiences, right? Because those are mass commercial experiences. So it's not unlikely that a group of people in, different parts of the world, if they come from a certain class background, for example, and a certain relationship to consumerism, would have that experience. But also that the feelings attendant to those commercial experiences were also very similar. So like when I was growing up, I listened and was first getting political around the time, I suppose, of after 9/11. Like 9/11 was the first sort of major political thing that I kind of opened my eyes to the fact that there was a political sphere in the world and so on. I listened to bands like Rage Against the Machine. I even bought that god-awful magazine, Adbusters. Do you remember that? And I remember like the feeling that I got from the book, which really struck a chord with me, was on the one hand, I felt kind of satisfied that these things were political and were speaking to some realities in the world. But just beneath the surface, I was kind of aware that it was meaningless and not really touching the sides of anything and sort of stupid. And I was haunted by that feeling. I really think you get that across in the book, that feeling of being haunted, that feeling of sort of, I think I thought all my life, am I really living through a real historical period, or are we living in this strangely muted era? And also when it comes to popular culture, one of the things you talk about is the constant nostalgia, the constant references to past subcultures that aren't really unique, that many subcultural expressions unique to our generation. Almost everything has been taken, has been cribbed from the past, from our parents' past, from Generation X, from that kind of thing. And I was very aware of that even growing up, that there wasn't anything really unique as a musical movement, as an artistic movement. There aren't really literary movements in the same sense anymore. And that really comes across in the book, and it's a very end of history reference But I said at the time, it was reading the book at that point was a bit like being read by Hannibal Lecter in Silence of the Lambs, where he can smell your your moisturizer that you put on 3 days ago and stuff. There's an uncanniness to it, which makes me wonder just how many people around the globe, particularly in the West, I suppose, had a similar experience during their political awakening of this half-life where you feel very enthused and very engaged with politics. At the same time, you're very aware that there's something not right. There's some element missing, and it's hard to place precisely what it is. Maybe that's just a common experience of sort of indulgent middle-class nads in their bedrooms. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, it's glad that it kind of frightened you to read it. It was that kind of Hannibal Lecter type experience. That's good to hear. But I think if you do take a step back and think like what defined the popular culture or kind of the more counter or oppositional parts of that culture, this idea of retromania. So like not just looking back to the cultural past, because every age does that, but to the quite recent cultural past. Like Britpop is a reboot of the 60s. It's like people who were alive in the 90s were alive in the 60s, and they can see that. And so I think it's just a sign of I've got a quick answer. It's just a sign of an exhausted culture. But I think there's a reason for that. And I think it relates to what happened in the 80s. And we'll come on to this, I'm sure, in some of the other questions, but essentially that the dynamics that had been given to previous generations of basic class struggle, it changed in a number of important ways. And so that cultural dynamism, which comes from that kind of social and political struggle, wasn't there anymore. So you basically have run out of ideas, and so you just keep recycling and sampling the past. And it does feel strange, I think, to grow up in that period, or at least that's, I think, how the three of us experienced it.
I wouldn't argue with you about rave, for example. When you were talking about that, it made me, somewhere in the back of my brain, I remember there was maybe a story of during lockdown, there was a boy who had organized a illegal rave, and then when the police came, he said it was like an anti-capitalist action, which is exactly I guess what you're talking about. But I think for me that like that kind of end of history, and like seeing like pop culture as part of that end of history, that point is all about a kind of, the resistance is like there's frivolity and it's carnivalesque, but it seems today like there's quite a lot to be serious about: climate change, failing economies, populist explosions, new plagues, all those sorts of things. So why do you think it is that the left continue to look to pop culture for legitimation and authenticity? I see it all the time that the left is constantly looking to popular culture to try and give itself that type of edge. I think I can probably predict your answer, which is this kind of like hollowing out, but I wonder what your thoughts were on it.
Well, if you were going to predict the answer, I now have to come up with another one off the cuff, so as not to be too predictable. But no, as you were sort of asking that question, it did make me, think that it's interesting that, the words that you used there were legitimation and authenticity, and that's what, the left looks for. And I think that is quite telling, that it's not authority. It's not a kind of, that isn't the primary political value necessarily. It's something else. It's something which is more of a kind of self-expression, or something along those lines. And that, I think, is arguably a legacy of 1968. I think you can read possibly too much into that period, but I think it definitely plays a role of essentially uprooting some of the hierarchies and the kind of the staid old modes of political action, and replacing them with something which is more individualized, is more atomized, potentially. And I don't think that's necessarily a good thing. I think, in fact, I think Mark Fisher is an interesting example here, because I think he plays a role of in quite a lot of this thought, and that's I guess a line of kind of political analysis that I'm not particularly sympathetic to, at least in certain kind of expressions of it, because I think it does miss that kind of central idea that if you want to be serious about politics, then you need to have some notion of authority. You need to have some idea of how you're going to organize politically and represent the interests, specifically class interests of people. And that isn't the kind of carnivalesque, rave occupied type of action, which can be satisfying. But I think it's just better to keep those things separate. If you want to do politics, it's one thing. If you want to go and rave, it's another thing. And but the second of those things isn't bad, but it's just too easy. That's, I guess, my kind of, I'm a bit of, maybe just a bit of a Puritan at heart, and it's too easy to say, yeah, going raving and like that's anti-capitalist action. It just, like, you shouldn't let yourself off the hook, I think.
Yeah.
So I should add to that, free Britney and all that kind of stuff. I mean, that's the kind of stuff we're talking about. It's an authenticity crisis as well, isn't it? There's a horror on the left today of like, we don't represent the way that most people in society think, which can be a healthy impulse and a deeply unhealthy one, especially if you think like, what most people really care about in society is Britney Spears, right? Which is probably not true. But anyway, I wanted to ask, I think it's central to this book, and it's central to a lot of left thought today, serious left thought, that there was a moment where, central to this thesis of the end of history is a class political act or series of actions, which is the removal of working class agency from the stage of history, the disappearance of a mass working class agency, political project, etc. And that kind of underpins this entire period. I mean, we'll get on to discuss it later, but you talk about the problems of attempting a left-wing political project when that doesn't manifest itself, and the problems that creates for left-wing politics. But this can almost become like a mystical thing, and it's the million-dollar question, or how expensive that question is, whatever. At this point, it's the big question of left-wing politics: is why has that situation occurred, and why has it persisted for so long? Why has it persisted throughout all these decades now? That the working class has remained at arm's length from not just one or two or three areas of political life, but basically all areas of political life and many areas of public engagement beyond formal politics. So I always think there's kind of three major inputs you can claim for this problem. One is a series of defeats across large parts of the world for the workers' movement. In this country, that was things like the miners' strike and some other major industrial disputes as well, but there were actually simultaneously many severe defeats for working class self-organisation in the period. There was the collapse of the Soviet Union and the enormous ideological blow that represented to any alternative to capitalism. And a third, which I suppose dovetails with the first, is changes in the structure of the global economy at both a national and a global level, which reorganized economic life and disrupted patterns of working class self-organization up to that point. I mean, but perhaps you have others. But what explains this decades-long disappearance from public life of the working class on a mass level?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say I would agree in particular with two of the things that you outlined. And just to add a little bit to the first one, that's the political defeat of the working class. I think that, that the scale and consequences of that, I think we still really have to get our head around. There's a really, I'm talking about our book, but can also praise other books. There's a really fantastic book by James Hartfield, which I don't know if you've come across, called The Death of the Subject Explained. And he essentially links the political defeat of the working class in the UK, for example, in the 80s, as you said, David, to the theoretical reorganization of politics away from a notion of subjectivity or kind of working class collective agency. This idea that the working class can remake society becomes less and less important, less and less central to the politics of the left, and we can talk for ages about what is the left and what does it mean. But I think that hits the nail on the head, that the political defeat became became a kind of central part of the way that politics has been thought about. So I think that is absolutely of primary importance. You talked about the collapse of the Soviet Union and economic changes, and I think those are both extremely important. But one thing I would say is that there's been a dynamic of simultaneous elite and mass withdrawal, so that hollowing out of politics, which Peter Mayer, for example, is closely associated with, which means that the political structures that we have are not necessarily intended to mobilize working class people into politics, but instead to do something very different. They are essentially sequestered in Westminster, like divorced from their social bases, hollow internally, and that is a dynamic which also plays into EU membership and the changes in the state that's effectuated. But I think that it's definitely worth kind of reflecting on the fact that has been the central dynamic of politics, has been a hollowing out and a demobilization of people. So it's not designed at present for mass politics. So that's why I think in particular Brexit was so important, because it kind of turned that on its head to a certain extent, or revealed some of the contradictions and limitations in the existing political structures that we had. I think one symptom or one kind of sign that maybe this could be changing, or that that kind of retreat of working class from mass politics up until that period of 2016, we're in a slightly different period now, is that there was a moral panic. I remember this in the 2010s about apathy. Like, clearly there was a problem with legitimating the system, because politicians were always trying to have ways to get people more involved in politics, get people more interested. Like, why are these idiots not kind of voting, or not kind of engaged, and not like reading all the things they need to read to be good political citizens? And then pretty much straight after 2016, the moral panic became instead about ignorance, that people were low information voters, or that they didn't know what they were doing, or actually they should really probably get back in their box. And I don't want to sound like, rave too much about this, but I think it's definitely something to experience that firsthand, and to be on the side of the Brexit debate that we were, or that at least that Phil and myself were, that there was a real kind of threat to and worry about the position of various people in politics, when there was a suddenly there weren't the movements and the organizations to really put this into practice, but there was the threat of the return of the people to politics.
That's really interesting, George. I mean, I did notice this when you're talking there. It just reminded me of it, that you do have the starting point of 2016, but obviously, like, for me, the starting point is probably 2014, when the Scottish independence referendum, which I think has a lot of similarities, which obviously David and I came on your podcast and we had that type of discussion. But I do remember the questions about, apathy, and hand-wringing about apathy. But what Scottish independence, the referendum on independence, and Brexit really proved was that, see, when the stakes are high, people will mobilize, like, people will engage, like, and part of the issue with politics, and I see quite a lot on the left at the moment, this kind of like refocusing on localism, because they've kind of like lost national politics, so we've got to like refocus on like local issues and local elections, and then wonder why like nobody gives a shit. It's because just like the stakes are so incredibly low, and you have to like look at how referendums have become almost poles of attraction for class politics. I mean, that's not what I was going to ask, but I mean, it was just as you were talking there that it occurred to me.
No, it's a good point, and I think the dividing line at 2016, we went back and forward a lot in the writing of this, and I'm particularly, I have to depart from the collective authorship and say I'm particularly keen on to say that 2016 was that dividing line, because I do think that that Brexit plays this might just be my English parochialism, it could well be, but it plays an important role as a dividing line, as a kind of, this is the first real challenge to the EU, which is this this institution which represents so many of the things about the post-politics that was dominant during the end of history, that it's just, I think it's a really signal kind of event. But that, of course, could mean that or in fact, it almost certainly does mean that whatever led to that kind of expression was already in place many years before. So yeah, I mean, it's always quite arbitrary having these certain dates to divide up the world, but yeah, I think it's useful to a certain extent.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, the whole kind of like the end of history brand, if you like, I think is really interesting. And we've already spoken about like Fukuyama and like what that end of history means and like your views on it. But for me, there's a fairly obvious problem, which is that as we see like these referendums become poles of attraction for class politics, whilst, you know, capitalist democracy is failing everywhere, there's still no actual serious force that's claiming to represent something better than capitalism. And I just wondered, like, why is that? Why is there no serious force that seems to be able to represent something better? And is there a hope do you think that there's a hope of alternatives to capitalism re-emerging?
So yeah, I mean, I think this is a really good question, and so just to take the first part, and this is on the end of history. I think that's the current period is kind of a double negative. It's the ending of this period of the end of history without anything that can bring into effect a new period. I mean, personally, I would say it's quite evident that at the moment we have this combination of a really apparent decay of society, like a prolonged and deep legitimation crisis, combined with a defeated, disorganized, demoralized working class. There's no force in society capable of revolutionarily reconstituting it, to use the kind of the older language. And I think that is still the point of reference that I would have. I mean, and in terms of alternatives to capitalism, I think, I mean, I would have to say that I don't agree with that idea of alternatives to capitalism. I think it's about, you know, to go back to the title of the podcast, Aufhebunga, it's about like Aufhebung, it's about transcending capitalism. And there's only one force in society that can do that, and that is the organized working class. So I think in the absence, or I mean, that's, you know, pretty like bog standard like Marxist reading, I would say. I mean, and so in that sort of situation, you don't want to have to reach for the morbid symptoms phrase, but that's essentially what you do have. You have different sorts of capitalism, the eco-capitalism, techno-capitalism, neo-feudalism, to go kind of in a different direction, universal basic income and fully automated luxury communism. These are all types of capitalism. Yeah. Because the only, and I wouldn't say alternative, but the only like progressive step in terms of historical progress of working class power is not on the horizon at the moment. And the reason for that is that, you know, that social force was defeated and disaggregated and demoralized and demobilized. I mean, and that's, you know, I'm using a lot of words which might make it sound like, you know, I'm quite negative about it, but actually I'm extremely positive. I think the possibilities for this sort of political project, which is about working class power, are greater than they have been for any period during the end of history. So we're in a situation of possibility if we're prepared to put in like 25 years or whatever of work to do it, because I think the most likely situation post neoliberalism, and I think this is, you know, the sort of situation we're moving to now, is probably like something worse than the present. I don't know how you guys have enjoyed, that's not the right word, how you guys have experienced the pandemic, but it certainly suggests that there is something which is worse than the current organization. You know, a very atomized and a sort of society which has a lot of very serious problems and no solutions to them, but has basically nothing other than stasis to keep it moving forward, because there isn't that alternative force that can take control, basically.
I mean, it's thinking about how you emerge from the end of history, right? I mean, it strikes me sometimes that I agree, like the defeat is very, very profound, right? So you could look at it in terms of there's layers of rubble above us. Do you know what I mean? Where the idea of a social transformation of a mass working class politics is very deeply submerged at this point. There's not a living organizational memory of it. You know what I mean? People don't, we've reached a point in the development of history where people don't say, remember when we as working class people had a huge amount of influence over, say, industrial policy in Britain. You would have to be very old and very well acquainted with that past at this point to even remember that that was once a thing. So I think you're right, it implies a long journey. But there's other factors here. It's not just that there was a physical, as it were, political defeat for the working class in the sense that the unions were dismantled, old industrial communities were broken up, political parties were hollowed out. I mean, these are very coherent, they kind of manifest these sorts of things. There have also been psychological changes in society and ideological changes which have attended this stuff. You talk, and I think it's not really recognised enough how important this is, the retreat from sort of the position of public citizen to private self. For a long time on the left, you've had people say things like, and I think to an extent it was groping towards the truth, people would say things like, well, the industrial front has collapsed, right? Working class strength in industry is dissipated. And what this has meant is that working class activity has relocated, say, to street level movements, or it's relocated into, say, an electoral thing like Corbynism, right? But the much more, or you get people, as Kat says, well, the working class doesn't see its interests represented at a national level anymore. It sees them interested in the communities at a local level. The real movement isn't from the workplace to the streets or the political party to the community. The real movement is from public man, like in the name of that book, Fall of Public Man, to private self, the retreat inwards into one's own psychological life, slightly less insularly, into one's own relationships, family relationships, friends, people narrativizing their own lives, experiential capitalism, all this kind of stuff. How does that get broken down? And the question that hung over for me reading that section of the book was, that what I'm scared of, in a way, is that this actually has deeper roots that go all the way back, say, to the Second World War and the growth of liberal humanitarianism, the growth of the idea that none of us have the right to propose a grand solution to society's problems, and that this is an inherently dangerous totalitarian thing, and that all we have the right to do, and you get this in the contemporary leftism as well, you don't have the right to tell someone else how they should do something, live their life, organize their society. The most you have the right to do is decide how you organize your own morals, adjudicate your own conscience, etc., etc. How is something as abstract a cultural and ideological change as that overcome?
I mean, can I just say, the thing David's talking about that being prevalent on the left, it's like, the railway dilemma or whatever it's called. What's the name for that sort of thought experiment?
The trolley problem.
The trolley problem, except the person who is standing at the lever on the contemporary left has a speech bubble saying, but who am I to pull the lever? That's the problem.
Yeah. I mean, I don't have an easy solution, unfortunately. Sorry. I don't have one simple trick that capitalists hate that you can just kind of take away and do. But I think, I talked earlier about authority, and this I think is a concept that, at least, which I've found myself sort of returning to again and again, like this idea from Rousseau, what is it to be like an active rather than a passive citizen? What is it that allows you essentially to feel like you have the authority individually and collectively to put into place a political solution to social problems, or like, you know, to put it more directly, to kind of impose a rational plan on society? I mean, that is a really big question. And I think, yeah, there's definitely a big cultural element of it. We have lost this idea of subjectivity, of being like an active, being a rational individual who makes decisions, takes responsibility for those decisions, and that's the basis of society. And that's an old Enlightenment idea. And if that's gone, then, you know, there's no hope really. But I don't think it is. I think it's been under really sustained attack, really been undermined. We're now told that we can be kind of tricked by social media, we can be conned into buying things, all this sort of thing. But actually, you know, that's where all kind of socialist, all you know, Marxist politics starts, is with the individual being able to make decisions and to take responsibility and to kind of build projects with political authority. So, I mean, how you like do anything about this practically is a big question. But I think that's sort of what I would lean towards, is thinking that there must be something about the left's kind of instinctive turning away from authority, which really is illustrative, and that's really where to push things forward and to try and develop things, maybe.
Yeah, no, I think that's interesting. I mean, I was obviously hunting in the book for something, right? Because I instantly agreed with with the framing of the question so much that I was kind of hunting around in it for how do we pull the lever, right? Which is a question beyond the scope of the book, it must be said. I mean, it's kind of touched on here or there. But, I mean, there's an excellent section in the book, again, much of which I agree with, called Protest All You Like, which is a sort of brief history of recent social movements, most of which I dare say we've all been involved in one way or the other, and again, I mean, I think this is a like critique properly understood in the German philosophical school is exploring the limits of something, not dismissing it, not just saying, well, that was a load of old shite, it shouldn't have happened, right? We should have been doing something else with our time than you know, say the anti-war movement or the student movement or Occupy or the anti-austerity movement and so on. But I mean, I suppose the question I took away from it was a wee bit. Again, I've got another end of history film reference, which is The Sixth Sense. Right after reading that section of the book, I had a dream where I found out, like Bruce Willis's character. Sorry to ruin the film for you if you're one of the 3 people on planet Earth who's never seen it. I find out, like Bruce Willis's character, that I've actually been dead for the whole period of the film, right? So I found out that all the way from me being a school-age arse who reads Adbusters and listens to, you know, The Prodigy, right? All the way through to now, I'd actually been dead, right? And I hadn't actually participated in anything with any meaning, right? I suppose it's quite haunting. I suppose what I'm asking is, do you think that repoliticization, that there are things going on now and even before 2016 which have aided in that repoliticization? The example that occurs to me is the anti-war movement, right? Which the limitations of which you discuss in the book, but it did actually have a politicizing influence. Basically, Corbynism, and this is underestimated by people who either came from the student movement into the Labour Party or who are old hands on the Labour left. Neither of these groups particularly want to admit this, but Corbynism has basically stopped the war in the Labour Party, right? And that's why it had such a preponderance on questions of foreign policy, for example. But like, if you look at the average Corbyn rally in 2015, I'm pretty sure it looks like a Stop the War rally from 2003 through sort of 2007. And one of the points you make in the book, and I hope you're right about this, I'm actually not as convinced of this, is that one of the things that the Sanders and Corbyn and the left populist movement did was destroy horizontalism. Please Please let that be true. The dumbest idea which has emerged in the left in recent decades. But doesn't that show that even these social movements, which are necessarily limited by their historical conjuncture, they can build over time to help the repoliticization of the present period?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, there's I guess on the point of horizontalism, I think that touches again. I don't want to force it as a theme of the conversation, but again touches on the idea of authority. If nobody is willing to take authority, is nobody to not just to take authority individually, but to build it collectively, then you are left with a somewhat ridiculous situation where you have a supposedly political organization that cannot internally make decisions to create demands. On reflection, have kind of the Corbyn and Sanders campaigns kind of destroyed that model of organizing on the left? I don't know. I don't think so, because there is still potentially something to be gained in certain sorts of material sort of situations by having a bit more diffuse responsibility within an organization. I'm not trying to be sort of too cryptic, but like the idea that in certain kind of culture wars struggles, you could have there is a kind of a value to having a kind of like everybody takes responsibility, so nobody's accountable sort of position. No, I mean, but to the kind of the main point of the question, can political movements serve to repoliticize? Yeah, I think it's a good question. Like, where does the impulse for politics come from, and how is that catalyzed and mobilized? And I think, ultimately my impulse would always be that it comes from a contradiction in capitalism. It comes from the fact that labor and capital have opposite interests, and there's no reconciling them. You can't paper over that. There's always going to be some conflict, some struggle generated by that. And the question is like, how is that managed on one side, and how can you organize it on the other? That might not be a very satisfying answer though, but it's a difficult question. I mean, you got to cut me some slack.
There's I got so annoyed with horizontalism that it made me a bit sick, because you also say in the book, we shouldn't also rehabilitate the idea of the charismatic leader. And indeed that some people on the right do this and will continue to do it as a response to the continued de-democratization of society. But, there's this, it's a thing I think Zizek might have pointed out. There's something almost hilarious about the fact that a generation of horizontalist movements resulted in, and like feminist movements and politics that focused a lot on individual personality and interrelational behavior and so on, ended up in the Corbynism and Sandersism, sort of charismatic parties, like party leaderships, and the guys who are leading them are old white men who are almost sort of Abrahamic figures leading us out of the desert. They almost couldn't have been more stereotypically old world and not of the kind of nouveau left sort of identity and interpersonal politics.
Well, I think it shows what happens when you could say sort of the ideological factors around horizontalism meet with the material reality of these hollowed out party structures. You do get a kind of a populist type structure, which is essentially to say you have a leader, and then the base is kind of not very well connected. There aren't those intermediary institutions within the party, or they are, but they don't work in the way that they could. And that's I think hardly surprising, given the Labour, for example, the massive increase in membership around the kind of Corbyn period, which went against all the other social democratic parties in Europe. But that didn't instantly democratize the party. I mean, I personally am of the opinion that the Labour Party is done and dusted at this point, and that's a good thing. In fact, it's a necessary thing. But I think there's, there have been some interesting analyses of what really happened with all of the new members who came in, and what and why it was that there was and that the debate and the conflict was so kind of rancorous within the Labour Party, because there wasn't any wider terrain for that to happen. So you had these are kind of essentially like, this is where the politics was happening of a certain sort, was within the Labour Party rather than a kind of broader canvas.
I mean, we were talking about those kind of like Abrahamic figures of Sanders and Corbyn, these older men, leading the charge, if you like, leading us out of the desert. But I feel like, the pendulum is kind of like swung back the other way. Obviously, it's not going very well for Starmer. And we're recording this before the result in Bailey and Spin, which I'm sure lots of people will be watching with interest. And in the book, you make this distinction between post-politics and anti-politics. I just wondered, do you not, I get the distinction and I get the points that you make, but don't you think that mainstream centrist politicians are having a little bit of a renaissance? I'm thinking of Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, and, that there is a popular investment in the technocratic elite, even the core functions of the state. I'm thinking very specifically of particularly Fauci in the US. I don't know if you've been following this online, but you can get Fauci candles, a Fauci wallet. There was I've been watching quite a lot of this stuff on TikTok. There's people getting Fauci tattoos. So there's this kind of
really
popular investment in these figures of the technocratic elite, but also Mueller and people like that. I wondered how you reconcile that phenomenon with the argument more generally.
No, I think so. Fauci's an interesting example. It kind of sounds like a combination of Fendi and Gucci. So it could be a good brand, good high fashion, technocratic brand. No, I think it's just to kind of rehearse the distinction, because I think it is another really good question. But so the idea of post-politics, this is, the characteristic politics of the end of history. So this is 1989 to 2016, a form of government that tries to foreclose all political contestation by emphasizing consensus, kind of getting rid of ideology, and ruling by recourse to evidence and expertise rather than interests or ideals. And so that's been quite explored in the literature quite a lot. And then anti-politics, the way that we essentially sort of think about this is it's a rejection of the political establishment and its managerial approach to governing society. So it's just essentially that it's not exactly technocracy and populism, but there's certainly elements in both that map on there. And I think it's something which has been pointed out, that there is now this techno-populist synthesis, that there is a high level of popular support for technocratic modes of governance. There is characteristically appeals both to the people and to the science at the same time. And I think Boris Johnson is a good example of this in the handling of COVID. Really does show that these things are not perhaps particularly opposed, that they can be united quite well and quite effectively. And in fact, so Chris Bickerton and Carlo in Venezia Cetti, they've got a new book out, which is essentially on this exact thing. And they say, well, technopopulism is the logic of democratic politics. When you don't have all of these intermediary institutions, you kind of short circuit the links between the representatives and people, and so you have to play both sides at once. So you have characteristic appeals to the people alongside evidence and sage and all this kind of stuff. So so that is I would say the question then becomes, with reference to that kind of post-politics, anti-politics distinction in the book, is whether we're seeing here like genuinely popular support for technocratic modes of governance, or whether it's kind of the last bastion of the managerial class's kind of attempt to hang on to some sort of legitimacy and power. I mean, and I don't really know the answer to that, but I think in either case, it seems like this kind of popular investment in the technocratic elite and the deep state is quite brittle. I mean, I think in the sense that there has been relatively high support for lockdowns in the UK, but part of that explanation surely has to be that there was no alternative offered. Like, there was no real political contestation. I think COVID was experienced as a public health crisis and an economic crisis, but not a political crisis. And so that we don't really know the answer to that, because I don't think we haven't really tested what this sort of support looks like, because there's not been a kind of a systemic alternative as yet.
I mean, I was really interested in the book to see you talk about techno-populism, like this kind of hybrid of technocracy and populism. And it seems that the most successful politicians are combining those two things. I think that it's crucial for us to understand that combination in relation to our own experience in Scotland, where Nicola Sturgeon is simultaneously the voice of the establishment, but also the voice of the resistance to the establishment. And I just wanted to know, how stable do you think these new compounds of technocratic and populist rule are?
Yeah, I don't really know. I think there is clearly there's something quite contradictory at the core of what they're trying to do. At the one and the same time, appeal to a legitimacy that comes from the people and then from expertise, and those two things are not the same, unless you somehow make an argument, and this is what could well be done, that there is a sort of common sense in the people. So you need somehow but this isn't what as Sturgeon's doing or what Johnson's doing, that there is a kind of common sense in the people, and that's what needs to be mobilized. And you could have some weird sort of voting systems of people kind of pressing buttons, and that's what the policy is. But it strikes me that there is that contradiction, that there is a certain sort of weakness there. So to look at some of the kind of examples of techno-populism, some of the precursors, New Labour, the way that they kind of pioneered a lot of this polling technology, which means that you can sort of triangulate and you use some of the technocratic modes of like market research alongside the legitimacy. This is what people think, this is what people want. I mean, that project obviously ran its course, and so there's a shelf life to it, but I mean, it's difficult really to say how long that shelf life is going to be, because there aren't really, if as I mentioned before, that Chris Bickerton and Carlo's book is, if they're right, then this is like the rules of the game at the moment. So everybody's doing different sorts of techno-populism. It's but everybody has to do it because those are the things you have to appeal to. Then it's really it's really tricky to say what in the future could be an alternative to that. It's a good question. Again, it's like, I don't know. It should have been the short answer.
I'm really interested to read that book as well, because of the special application it has in Scotland. I don't know if it actually deals with the Scottish case, but we used to say until very recently, oh, isn't Scotland the peculiar case? And now I think it's actually not, and it's maybe the road to the next step for a lot of countries along this road. Because it's come from Scotland to the United States. It's and the weird thing about it is you really can, as Kat says, get popular investment, and at least among layers of the middle class and so on. I mean, I think there's little doubt at this point that Biden has quite successfully demobilized social movements in the United States, so that there is a relationship between these things. Nicola Sturgeon has certainly successfully demobilized popular efforts in Scotland, particularly around the independence question, and whole areas of the middle strata are absolutely in love with this formation of government. It exercises an almost hallucinogenic element over them, over parts of the media, the legal establishment, the scientific establishment, NGOs, academia. I mean, some of the stuff that the Scottish government's been getting away with in the last couple of years is really astonishing. But since we're constantly advertising this book, that's not the end of history, I would definitely recommend to people that they buy it. Actually, I mean, not just to slobber in praise over it, I think that this is like a necessary manual for anyone who's getting involved or who's interested in politics from a left-wing perspective in the current period, in terms of it being an overview of like literature from the last 30 or 40 years, but also with insights. I mean, I think that these are the discussions we need to be having. You in the book you posit three new ideologies for the coming period, for the 2020s. And in fact, I think this is part of the point, you can actually see a lot of them already. This isn't a kind of far-flung prediction. A centre-left that continues to hold on to elements of the fading neoliberal consensus. A centre-right which is more adaptable and reorganises different class elements into its coalition. And the Tories, I suppose, are a good platform for that. And then a threat from a kind of an authoritarian far right, which might pick up some of the slack where those centre-right projects aren't successful. I mean, do you think that there is any hope? I know we're talking only in the next few years, but do you think that there's any hope of a more radical left breakthrough, even if only with modest success in the coming period? And what do you think that project should be? I know this is because if you had the answer to it, you'd be doing it, right? But let's just play around with the idea. What do you think the radical left should be doing that would be meaningful?
So, I mean, this is obviously the in some ways the most important question. Like, what do you do about it? And I think just a bit of background, because I do have an answer. I'm prepared to to stick my neck out and answer that question. Might not be convincing. But I think the context here, to go back to the book and the kind of framework there, is that we have been experiencing a new kind of phase of class conflict. So which we kind of transitioned into towards the end of the 20th century, the working class defeated and disorganized. That happened in the 80s in the UK, as we've talked about. This kind of developed in some of the ways that we've also discussed. But this has really profound effects as well on the capitalist classes across the world. Like that dynamic of class struggle means that capitalists don't get their kind of dynamism from their innate genius at all. It's from class struggle. It's from the threat of working class organization and power. So without that kind of historical dynamic playing out in exactly the same way, this is my personal take, and this is something which doesn't, I think, come through in the book, because I think it's been in some of the discussions around the book, which has come out, and I think I should put my neck out and say this is what I think, is that the field is then comparatively more open for essentially middle class political projects, and that does come through in the book, but I think it's come through even more sort of strongly recently, that you have, it's not necessarily mass politics, but it's still class politics, and you have these kind of cultural. So politics at the moment looks like a lot of culture wars things, but actually there's a material basis there, and I think in the book that's some of the things that we sort of characterize the left as, this kind of technocratic do-gooderism. It's kind of not. It's deliberately a non-majoritarian class politics for the middle class, essentially, or the PMC, or the petty bourgeoisie, or however you want to call it. I mean, we can talk about that some other time. But so what do you do about this sort of situation? Well, I think one really big question is how you. Well, actually, maybe it's not that important though. How you orient yourself if you want to develop a political project to the left, quote unquote, the left. Is this essentially the group of people you want to talk to, or is it better to just put it in class terms and say, actually, it's working class, it's not the left, and those two things maybe, they've never been exactly the same thing, and maybe it's just time to lose that kind of language. But I think I guess the real practical question from my point of view, at least, is how you move from that kind of defense of democracy and freedom of speech that I think you have to engage in. We need those bourgeois rights, as they were once called, to transcend capitalism. How do you move from that to a kind of organization or a project that is going to look to have a class politics for the working class? And that's like, I don't know, it seems completely ridiculously so use the word grandiose a couple of times, but that's exactly what it would be for me to say, yeah, it's an easy solution here. We just need a professional organized revolutionary party. Here's my list, sign up to it. But as I said, the situation of, I think, like in Britain at least, of Brexit having really sunk Labour. It looked like at one point it was going to split the Conservatives. I think it's instead split Labour. It does mean that I think we're going to see in the coming years a clearer picture where it becomes more and more obvious that there is no political representation for working class people. Maybe the Tories will make a bit of a move towards this, but that's not their base. There's always going to be a really big tension within there, because that's not the people that, the home counties, the Tory members are not going to want the entire capacity of the state rerouted to the left behind areas, which they don't really care about. So, I mean, that's what I think we have to do, is some sort of project which looks to put political authority as relatively central, looks to defend and extend Brexit, and 25 years time you can see how successful it's been. But if you have an easier kind of way to do it than that, I'm all ears, because that sounds like quite a lot of work. I mean, it's actually quite fun in a way, or like quite rewarding. You're not going to have dreams that you're dead in this period. I think there's going to be a bit more kind of going on. But yeah, I mean, we had in an earlier version of the book, we had a kind of like this is our solution. But then we thought, no, we can't put that out there, because it's just ridiculous. And also, people would just think, what is this kind of book doing to say, right, here's the solution to all the problems. So yeah, I guess I think, to put it a bit more coherently and succinctly, I think essentially it's a period for theory. I mean, that might be quite self-serving as a podcaster, but I really don't think we have the answers to the question, is there another mode of organizing than a professional kind of organized party? Like, what is it that we actually need to do? I think that is still to be determined at this point.
Great. Yeah, that was really interesting. I mean, and thanks for sharing your solution with us.
Is it a solution? I think it's
is it a solution? I mean, I'm not like a sort of a time for theory. Is not like doesn't make my heart race.
No, but I mean, I think that is I guess I wanted to kind of be a bit provocative, and just in saying, like, it's not time for action, because the structures for that action on there. It's not time for like one final push and we'll get there. It's not time for any of the things that, I think we've all heard at various different points in the past, past decades, whatever. It's really, all those old models don't really work. And so, it's probably a time for trying new things, and those things not working maybe, but and so that's theory, right? I don't mean like go to the library. I mean, put some ideas into practice. Time for theory and praxis. How about that?
I mean, I think that it's a solution. I mean, listeners can feed back on what they think of it. I mean, a lot of my political outlook at the moment is defined by what I would call the politics of rupture. Like I'm very like interested in like there is a small crack in this thing. Like, I mean, or like a big crack. How can like the left like prise that crack open? Because I think that there's this general process of disintegration happening, like Britain's terminal crisis, the crisis of the Labour Party, the crisis of the British state. I mean, this was always the big problem for someone like Corbyn, is like, you know, even if he was to get elected, he still inherits this the quote unquote problem of Ireland, the problem of Scotland, like these sorts of things. And I think that there are little or big cracks appearing everywhere. And what I think is important for the left is to sort of to get your foot in there and begin to wedge things apart, break things up, disrupt.
Yeah, but just one thing to add to that. I think that idea of politics of rupture is I like that phrase, but that's why I would say the Corbyn project was always doomed to fail, because there was a very real rupture, like 2016. That was the rupture, and what happened?
Yeah.
What I mean, it's you know, obviously being there, so I was just about to go into a rant, but like, to be analytic about it, like the left threw its weight behind the status quo against rupture. Like that's what happened.
Yeah.
And so I mean, maybe that you're right. Then it is about thinking where do those ruptures happen and what do you do about them. But like, I mean, the most, maybe I'm being too negative, but the more recent kind of experience is that there was a process of shutting down that potential rupture, because Brexit was potentially very, very disruptive, and in fact turned out to be. But Corbyn was unequivocally, you know, on the side, on the wrong side. And you can explain that a number of different ways, but I think that's what happened.
I think this is an important thing, though, if we're talking about, like, oh God, that Gramsci phrase again about, you know, the interregnum, right? If this is an interregnum, right? I mean, that
we use the word interregnum in the book deliberately.
Yeah. Yeah, you got to avoid that particular.
Find synonyms for it. Just click, right click on word.
As someone who's basically written every day about politics for about 6 years, that has been my best friend, the Google thesaurus. Yeah, but I think a major look. Definitely the year 2016. I mean, to go back to that, I agree with you, George. I think that is the seminal year, right, where there is a watershed, an obvious watershed in history. And I think it obviously split the left. I mean, it obviously split the left between people whose basic attitude was, be careful what you wish for. This, a kind of neurotic, anxious fear is a major psychological part of contemporary leftism. And they're not just going to say it. I mean, they obviously said it to us in 2014 about the British state. Oh, be careful what you wish for. Yeah, you'll get rid of the British state and you'll end up in something worse. By the way, the thing that annoys me about that kind of like, it's an almost sort of OCD quality to it, is I assume that we'll go from one difficult position to another. You're just describing human history, right? Apart from anything else. And then it was with Brexit. Oh, yeah, you've got this great critique of the European Union. Be careful what you wish for, because the thing that's coming next is much worse. Oh, yeah, you don't like the Democratic Party, but now Trump's in and he's a fascist. There's a fascist in the White House, and you'll be, laughing on the other side of your face in a couple of years when people are being sent to the camps. Here's the thing I think is coming next, is the Labour Party, right? I agree with you, George. I think it's days done. I almost think it's irrelevant at this point whether or not you think it's a good thing that the Labour Party is going to go or a bad thing. But I guarantee you there will be a lot of people on the left saying, be careful what you wish for. Yeah, the Labour Party's dying and you're laughing about it. But in 10 years' time, Britain will be like Hungary, right? We'll have, or, something like that. We'll have a centre-right party and a far-right party, and you won't be laughing then. I think if the left keeps subjecting itself to this kind of anxiety-driven paralysis, that's when it makes itself totally, totally irrelevant. I mean, look, these institutions that have been hollowed out after decades and decades, some of them are going to die. That's part of the historical course. And I'm not really sure that there's anything that can be done to stop it. I'm already hearing people saying when Starmer goes, let's get Don Butler in, right? Which is a great idea. That, this kind of stuff is totally backwards in my eyes. If there's nothing, I don't agree with this with Yvette Cooper. Cat says, there's a great lineup coming in next. Faulty as Corbyn was, by the way, I think he was probably the best shout they ever had. I think he's better than McDonnell, etc. Anyway, I think it's important over the coming period that the left's not precious about these historical developments. And I think it's a terrible trap to get caught in this kind of stuff, to be so afraid of historical developments that you cling to these dying institutions. I'm sure we all basically agree about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just take it one step further, and I would say that this is arguably the left's role at the moment, is to defend the status quo, particularly this fascism blackmail that you kind of mentioned. It's like this idea of, be careful what you wish for. You could get hungry. You could get fascist. You could like anything other than rupture, because rupture leads to fascism. And I think like that is it's a question like who are we talking about when we're talking about the left, and what political function do they play? What class interests do they serve? Because I think it was quite a clarifying process through Brexit, like to basically think, okay, where is it that people stand on the fundamental question of like, do you want to change society, or are you too scared? Like, are you prepared to take authority and responsibility, or not? And I think that will be one of the kind of the things that we'll see play out in the next few years. And I guess it's like, then it becomes a practical question, like on what side do you put yourself? Like, are you prepared to go against some people that you know well, and your kind of your social circle in defending something that's potentially disruptive, or not? Maybe that's the challenge that I should have put to, when you ask me like what to do about it. Maybe that's the kind of the challenge to listeners in the next few years is going to be like, what if we have other things like Brexit or these sorts of questions come up? Like, is it part of that fascism blackmail that you have to essentially defend the status quo, or do you say, well, actually no, like this is the position that's in the interest of working class people. This is the position that I'm going to take, and where you stand on those sorts of issues.
I mean, I think that fascism blackmail, what was it, Trump derangement syndrome? I think that type of role for the left is going to become even bigger. I think that is the route that we're going down, which is, don't break anything unless you release some monsters in its path. And I think that was really clear with the US presidential elections. The fact that, the left needed to create a bogeyman, one single dislikable entity, in order to, rouse itself. Like, it's a symptom of this type of hollowness, like this political establishment, which has nothing positive to say and nothing concrete to offer. And I think that, it's quite a sad point for the left. I mean, I see that you said you were optimistic. Maybe I should catch some of that. Reasons to be optimistic, you say, George?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's like any process which clarifies where people stand, that's a reason for optimism. I mean, it might turn out, we're not on the left, we're against the left. I mean, that's what happened in Brexit, and that was I think maybe that's something which I didn't really touch on in the, when we're talking about the kind of the end of history period. I was like, oh yeah, I'm a lefty. That means I'm cool. That means I'm kind of, actually it just means I'm cool. That's basically what it means. But now actually, maybe that's not the case. Maybe, there are different terms of kind of political division coming about. And that's, that is a reason to be optimistic, because you then see where, where people stand, and you can see where, whose side people are on, which is I think a good thing, because obviously one one characteristic of that transition from the end of history to the end of history, or at least I would say, was that it was really unclear like what was happening, or more, there was a whole lot of cultural froth and culture wars around all these kind of things. Like you said about Trump, there was a really kind of the objective analysis. If you were looking for that, it was not possible to find in liberal newspapers, for example, if it ever is. But like, you know, surely at least some who should know better just completely lost it. So now, you know, maybe we're entering a situation where it will be good that things are clearer. I think that is a reason for optimism.
Yeah, it's a nice note for us to finish on, I think, too. We've been recording for about hour and a bit after our pleasantries at the start. So thank you so much, George, for joining us, and I really wish you all the best with the book and the podcast, and hopefully once we can get you up to Scotland and you can do a live event.
Yeah, that would be fantastic. Actually, I think we had a whole global tour planned, like global tour in the sense of an excuse to go to various places. So yeah, we'd be very much up for that.
Magic. Well, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks very much. It's great.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah.